Well, let me speak firstly to the women and ask you a question. I wonder, how did you feel when you learned that we were looking at Proverbs 31 this morning? I imagine most of the women, or many of the women, you were getting ready to feel probably two or three things. Firstly, inadequate, maybe a bit guilty, maybe even a little bit judged. I think that's largely because of the way Proverbs 31 has been viewed and used. Usually Proverbs 31 is presented as a kind of how-to guide to motherhood or to womanhood. Now, let's say at this point and be really clear, Proverbs 31 does have things to say to women. But if we're going to understand this passage properly, well, then we need to ask a couple of questions to begin with, don't we? And got the screen. I'm going to ask the first question. Question 1. Who is Proverbs 31 speaking to? That's always a really important question whenever we come to the Bible, isn't it? Who was the first intended audience? And the answer, we read it together. Chapter 31, verse 1. The sayings of King Lemuel, an inspired utterance his mother taught him. So, first and foremost, Proverbs 31 is speaking not to a woman or to women generally. Proverbs 31 is speaking to a man. Okay, second question. What does this passage call him to do? If it's speaking to a man, what is the call to action in this passage? Well, there's only one call to action. There's only one thing, certainly in verses 10 to 31, that this guy is told to do, and it's there in verse 31. Let's look at it together. Honour her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gates. So only one call to action. It's directed towards the man, and it's this: praise a woman like this. Honour her for what she's done. So before we go any further in this passage, let's recognise first and foremost that this passage isn't telling women to do anything. It's written to a man, pointing him to do something, telling him what is praiseworthy in a woman. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying this has nothing to say to women. It does. But let's just get our heads around this first point. Proverbs 31 is speaking to a man. But why? Why is Proverbs 31 speaking to this guy? Well, remember what Proverbs is all about. Proverbs is speaking to a young man with his whole life ahead of him. And Solomon, his father, is instructing him, even pulling in from outside sources, King Lemuel, King Agur in the previous chapter. He's pulling in outside sources as well as his own words to teach his son how to live God's way in God's world. And it makes sense then, doesn't it, that he should end the book with a lesson about the noble wife. Think about it. Who generally is the most important person in a man's life? Well, if he's married, then it's his wife, isn't it? And so here's the point. Who you marry is really important. If you marry wrong, it doesn't matter how wise you are. If you marry wrong, it'll be a disaster. And you'll suffer for it for the rest of your life. That's true, isn't it? And actually, Proverbs tells us that. Let's just I've already said that. Let's go just look at a few Proverbs that speak about this. Proverbs 12, verse 4. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who shames him is as rottenness in his bones. Or, how about better to live on a corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife. It's quite a comical picture, isn't it? Here's this guy who's so browbeaten that he's just kind of clamoured to the corner of his roof. It's better to be there than inside. Or thirdly, a quarrelsome wife is like the dripping of a leaky roof in a rainstorm. Restraining her is like restraining the wind or grasping oil with the hand. And of course, let's be clear, remember, Proverbs is written to a man from a male perspective. This is true for both men and women. If you marry the wrong person, it can and indeed will have devastating effects. That's why we as a church, we do marriage prep. Whenever a couple comes to us wanting to get married, we sit down with them, we talk about marriage, what it looks like, how a successful marriage operates, because who you end up marrying, if you do marry, is a massive decision. And that relationship can either bring you immense joy or immense pain and heartache. And so Solomon ends his entire book with this lesson, the words of King Lemuel's mum about women. He wants to show his son, or she wants to show her son, what he should value. What should he be looking for? What is praiseworthy in a woman? So let's think about Proverbs 31 a little bit more. Let's try and understand what's going on. And let's ask this question. Who is the woman of Proverbs 31? And I think it's really important we understand this. Otherwise, there's the danger that all the women in the room will go home feeling guilty, inadequate, and maybe just a bit rubbish. And all the men might go home feeling a little bit peeved and disappointed that their wives don't quite match up to this woman. So what's going on here? Who is the woman of Proverbs 31? Well, the first thing I want us to recognise is she isn't a real woman. She's an idealised picture of a wife or mother. In fact, I think we could go as far as to say this. She is wisdom personified as a wife or mother. And therefore, the key thing for us to understand is that the specifics of what she does, they aren't translatable to every woman. I think there are 3 reasons we can say this, 3 ways we can tell she's not typical. Here's the first. The passage tells us she isn't. Just look at verse 10. A wife of noble character, who can find? Verse 10 explicitly tells us it's impossible to find a woman like this. Who on earth could fit the bill? Verse 29 explicitly praises her for surpassing all other women. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. So the woman of Proverbs 31, she's not typical. Here's the second reason we can tell she's not typical. Her situation is too ideal, isn't it? This woman and her husband are super wealthy. That's very clear, isn't it, from the passage. She's got wealth, kids and servants. Her husband is an elder respected at the city gate. Remember what Proverbs is doing. It's painting an idealised picture of the life of wisdom, of life lived God's way and how you can benefit from that. And here's this woman and her husband, and they've prospered through living God's way in God's world. Everything's gone right for them. But that's not always true, is it? The single mum off the Aylesbury estate, or the poor Christian woman in Ghana, simply couldn't achieve what this woman does. So this can't be a how-to guide for womanhood, because it's not a picture of life for most women. Here's the third reason, and I think this is the most striking of all. The structure of the passage reveals its purpose. This passage is structured in a particular way. It's called an acrostic poem. Okay, so there's the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Each verse begins with the first letter of the sequence of the alphabet. So verse 10 starts with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Verse 11 with the second. Verse 12 with the third, and so on. So what we have here is an A to Z of the perfect wife. So, it's aspirational, yes, and there are lessons to learn, both men and women. But it's not the case that you should be like this or you're rubbish, okay? As one preacher puts it, a guy called James Muldoon, a pastor in Reading, he says this: no one could be this omnicompetent. Or put it another way, no one could be this perfect. And just look at the passage with me. Let's just see that. Verse 13, she works with wool and flax, so she weaves her own fabrics. Verse 15, she gets up before sunrise. Verse 16, she's a property developer and she's planting vineyards. Verse 17, she's in peak physical shape. Her arms are strong for the task. She's hench. Verses 18 and 19, having been up before sunrise, she's up past sunset sewing. And verses 21 to 24, what she's sewing is high-end stuff. It's scarlet outdoor children's wear for the kids when it snows. Snows very rarely in Israel, but nevertheless, she's prepared. Linen bed sheets, verse 22, purple linen for herself. And verse 24, it seems that she's running a high-end, quite lucrative retail business, selling sashes to rich businessmen. Verse 26, she's incredibly wise. Verse 27, she's never idle. And verses 28 to 29, doing all of this, she's never struggled to find the work-life balance. She's not neglected her family. Her kids rise up and call her blessed, and her husband praises her. I praise her for the domestic bliss that she has managed to create. Now, understand then what's going on. This is a superwoman. She's doing it all, and she's doing it perfectly. So, ladies, I want to talk to you at this point as we look at this passage together. I don't want you to be weighed down because you don't match up to this woman. There are lessons to learn, and we're going to learn these lessons as we go through, both for men and women. But I want us, even before we get into the passage properly, to recognise this passage for what it is. And I'm going to put it up on the screen. This is what this passage is ultimately, or who she is. She's a picture of perfection. She's the A to Z of an idealised, perfect wife. And there's a reason. Because this is designed to teach a young man looking for a wife what he should value, what is praiseworthy. That's the key point of the passage, okay? She's the picture of perfection, an A to Z of an idealised, perfect wife designed to teach a young man who's looking for a wife what is praiseworthy. And that's key then. Because that means that primarily, as we've already seen, this passage is speaking to men. So let me ask you a question, particularly the men in the room. Men, how do you view women? How do you speak about women? After all, the only call to action in this entire passage is to a man, and it's about him speaking about women, isn't it? Verse 31, honour her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. The one thing this passage is telling us is how men should value and speak about women. So men, what do you value? What do you consider praiseworthy? about women. I was thinking about this week. Do you remember back in 2016, I think it was, when the American elections were going on? And recordings were found of Donald Trump saying some incredibly offensive, misogynistic things about women. And even admitting sexual assault. And do you remember how he brushed it off? He said it was just locker room talk, as though somehow that made it all okay. But men, let's be honest, locker room talk is a thing, isn't it? A bunch of blokes together who start talking about women can say all kinds of disgusting, demeaning things. And not only is it wrong because the Bible tells us that that kind of language is vulgar and dirty and doesn't belong on the lips of God's people, but actually I think it reveals something deeper, doesn't it? A bigger problem. It reveals something just about the way men look at women. Sometimes merely as objects, valued only for their face or their body or their kind of seductive ability. And women, maybe you buy into this a bit. If this is what men want, then this is what I need to be. And you see, in our society, in our own hearts, our view of women, both from a male perspective and a woman's perspective, can be completely misshapen. And we can value completely the wrong thing. But here is Proverbs reshaping our view of women, teaching us what God says is praiseworthy. So men, how do you speak about women? What do you consider praiseworthy? Husbands, what do you value about your wife? What do you want from her? As husbands, we can be guilty, can't we, of undervaluing or devaluing our wives. So, women, let me invite you to listen in, all right? Because if this is what God says is praiseworthy, then you need to know this. And there are lessons for you here. So women, listen in. But men, listen up. Because we're going to see here what God says is praiseworthy in women and what we, as men, should be valuing. All right, 3 things that are praiseworthy. And don't worry, I know we've been going a while, so these are going to be relatively quick. What is praiseworthy? Here's the first thing. Hard work is praiseworthy. Proverbs has had a lot to say about hard work already, hasn't it? We've seen the sluggard, and he's mocked and ridiculed because he stays in bed all day. He makes excuses why he can't go out the house. He says there's a lion outside. And eventually, he starves to death because he can't be bothered to lift food from the bowl to his mouth. So the sluggard in Proverbs is just an object of ridicule. And he's a picture of foolishness. But here, Proverbs 31, here we've got Miss Wisdom, the perfect wife. And what's she doing? She's working hard all day and all night. So look again, verse 13. She works with eager hands. Verse 14, she's off doing the shopping, getting the food in. Verse 15, she's up early making food for the family and even, strangely, for the servant girls. Now, why aren't they making the food? Well, who knows? But here's this lady, she's doing it. Verses 15 and 16, she buys this field and plants a vineyard. In fact, we're told she sets about her work vigorously and her arms are strong for her tasks. So she's developed guns through her hard work. And she's vigorous. Remember those Duracell adverts with the Duracell bunny and it's just going and going and going and going? That's what this woman's like. She never stops. Verses 18 and 19, she's up all night sewing. And then verse 24, as we already said, she's selling what she's made. Verse 27, she does not eat the bread of idleness. She works hard. That's the key point, isn't it? And as I said earlier, understanding this passage as an idealised picture of the perfect wife hopefully sets us free from thinking that we would be able to reproduce this kind of productivity. This woman is Superwoman. And particularly, don't take that on yourself if you're old or unwell or for other reasons you just couldn't match up to this. But what this passage is showing us is that living God's way in God's world equals working hard, doesn't it? Being productive. This is one way in which God has made human beings to flourish. Do you remember Adam and Eve when they were placed in the garden? They weren't there just to sit on their hands and do nothing. God gave them work to do. Before sin had entered and destroyed and ruined and broken the world, God gave them work to do. And so Proverbs 31 reveals this woman, wisdom personified. She works hard. And, notice, she works hard both in the home and outside of the home. That's interesting, isn't it? This week I WhatsApped several of the women in the church to try and find out their experiences of kind of working in this world as women. Here's what I got back. Two kind of main things. Firstly, there was a sense that within the Christian world, particularly among churches in kind of our circles, there's a sense in which women, but particularly mums, can feel looked down on or judged for their decision to go out to work. Maybe less so if they're in a kind of caring profession or working with kids, but nevertheless that disapproval can still be there. It's kind of a version of that idea that a woman's place is only in the home. And if she works outside of the home, then even if she's not doing something wrong, she's doing something less. It's the first kind of attitude that the women shared with me. Here's the second, from the complete opposite spectrum, that our society, on the other hand, completely opposes the idea of women staying at home and being homemakers and mothers. In fact, one person said that paid work is viewed differently to other kinds of work. That if you're not getting paid, it's just not the same. Even men, we can be guilty of that attitude, can't we? Only one of us works. Try looking after kids all day. See, there's these two kind of attitudes that pervade society and church. Actually, I think the Proverbs 31 woman, she kind of really cuts through all of that, doesn't she? Firstly, she challenges the view that women should only be at home and that it's wrong for a woman to go out to work. Look, this woman is a mum with household responsibility, and yet she's working outside the home. She's buying land, she's planting vineyards with her own earnings, we're told. She's bringing in an income separate to her husband through her skill and abilities. And notice, she doesn't fit the gender stereotypes that sometimes we think women should, does she? She's a successful businesswoman in her own right. If she was filling out one of those online forms where she had the drop box and she had to put in her profession, well, what would it be? Manufacturing? Property development? Farming? Retail? She's doing it all. Again, to quote James Muldoon, sometimes Christians are more sensitive to women going out to work than the Bible is. But she also challenges, doesn't she, the idea that our society has, which undermines and undervalues the role of motherhood and homemaker. Because here's this woman, and she's commended for the work, not just that she does outside, but the work she does inside the home. It's not seen as less than the other work she's doing. She's working, whether she's simply doing household jobs like providing food for her family, or whether she's bringing in an income. Work both inside and outside the home is equally valuable, equally commended, and equally praiseworthy. That's what we see here, isn't it? And that brings us back to the key point. Hard work is praiseworthy. And that becomes really obvious when we notice how often her hands are mentioned. Did you notice that in the reading? Look, verse 13, verse 17, verse 19, verse 20, and verse 31. Her hands are busy. She's not eating the bread of idleness. She's busy. I think there's a challenge for us here, isn't there? Are your hands busy? Or are they idle? I've been convicted about this myself, preparing this sermon. I waste too much time with my hands being idle, just scrolling through my mobile phone. If it's YouTube Shorts, you know, they can be addictive, can't they? Or something else, Twitter. Mobile phones can be dangerous for all kinds of reasons. But one big danger is that we can simply waste so much time staring at a screen endlessly. Well, that's not flourishing, that's vegetating, isn't it? It might not be the mobile for you. But let me ask you, are your hands strong to the task, or are they idle? This woman, whether in the home or out of the house, is working hard. And she's praised for it. Verse 31, honour her for all her hands have done. Hard work is praiseworthy. Jesus gave a whole sermon, didn't he? About how one day people will be judged on how hard they've worked, on the use of their time, their gifts, their talents. Are you using the gifts and the talents that God has given you? Are your hands busy being productive? Or are they idle? All right, here's the second thing. Sacrificial love is praiseworthy, much more quickly. This woman's working hard, but notice, we're not told that this woman is doing anything for herself, is she? Everything she does here is for other people. Whether that's for her family, her servants and her household, or even for the poor. Look at verse 20. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. Proverbs 31 is a beautiful picture, isn't it, of self-giving love. She demands nothing from anyone, but is constantly giving of herself. And it's beautiful. It's praiseworthy. Why is it beautiful? Why is it praiseworthy? Well, here's the key point. Because this woman is reflecting the kind of love, the kind of generosity we see in God, we see in Jesus. Do you see? This is the A to Z of a perfect wife. But if we imagine each of those, that A to Z, I know there's only 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, but work with me. If we take each of those like A to Z and we make it a dot, and we connect the dots, what do we get? We get a picture of Jesus, don't we? Of his self-giving, sacrificial love. All bound up in this picture of the noble wife. Giving, but not demanding anything in return. And so there's a lesson here, isn't there, for all of us, whether we're male or female, unmarried or married. Jesus' self-giving, generous love is the model. It's the pattern that all of us as God's people are called to imitate. This is what God says is praiseworthy. So let me ask you again. If we were to connect the dots of your life, do we see the outline of Jesus' generous, sacrificial, self-giving love? Do you open your arms to the poor and the needy? Among your friends, family, colleagues, would you be recognised as someone who gives without demanding in return? Women, is that true of you at work or at home? Men, is that true of you? Sacrificial giving, service, is praiseworthy. Here's the third thing. Godliness is praiseworthy. In the first letter of Peter, he says this, speaking to women, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewellery or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. And Proverbs 31 says something similar, doesn't it? Verse 30, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. That word charm, it talks of that kind of magnetic, seductive ability that women can have over men. They can have that kind of effect on a man, can't they? But, Lamuel's mum says, that can be deceptive. Just because she excites every bone in your body doesn't mean she's good news. And secondly, beauty is fleeting. I was looking at old wedding photos this week. Me and Sarah got married 15 and a half years ago. I'm treading very carefully. Sarah's actually held up really well. I haven't. I think that's been very clear to me. It's been like a 15-year kind of slow-motion car crash, facially, really. And ladies, you know this is true, don't you? Doesn't matter how many creams or lotions you put on your face, and it doesn't matter what the adverts tell you, beauty fades. But as Peter puts it, there is an unfading beauty. And it's the beauty we see in verse 30. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Remember, to fear the Lord is to recognise who God is and to be in awe of him. It's a fear that doesn't make us turn and run. It's a fear that makes us bow down and worship. Those who fear the Lord in the Bible are those who love the Lord. And Proverbs 31 says that is truly beautiful. That's where true beauty lies. It's in godliness. So again, there's a challenge here, isn't there? Women, let me ask you, how much do you focus on the way you look? On the way you're viewed by men? Remember, we said at the beginning, didn't we, that actually we can all buy into this kind of wrong idea of beauty, of what is valuable in a woman. How much have you bought into that idea? How much is it all about the external but not about the internal? Are you more concerned, let me put it like this, in how men look at you or how God looks at you? And men, this is written to teach men what to value. So are you more concerned about the way a woman looks or about her character, her godliness? Men, maybe you're looking to get married. You're looking for a girlfriend or a wife. Husbands, maybe you already are married. What are you more concerned about, her face or her soul? Now, to be clear, I just want to say this because I think it's important to say this. That's not to say that looks are completely unimportant. Okay, it's good to be attracted to your wife. And women, it's okay to want to be attractive. What we're seeing here is perspective, aren't we? Okay? It's the perspective to recognise that a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Nothing is said about her physical appearance except that she's got guns, you know, her arms are strong. That's the only thing we're told about her body. But that's the point. Because it doesn't matter what she looks like. It matters that she loves and fears the Lord. And let me just say this as we come to an end in a moment. If you are looking for a husband or wife, this is the key thing. Single men, single women, if you're looking for someone to share your life with, recognise what's most important, according to Proverbs, according to the Bible generally. Does this person love and fear the Lord? Let me say this, that's not the only question you need to ask, but it's the most important question to start with. Okay, let's come to an end. We're going to end with one last question, and don't worry, it's quick. But it's the question we always have to ask whenever we're in the Old Testament. And it's this. Where's Jesus? The whole Bible is pointing to Jesus, both Old and New Testament. Where's Jesus? Well, remember what this passage is. It's a young man looking for a wife. And we're being told at the end of this book what he should value. If we wanted to sum it up, given this is Solomon's son who's in question, the question really is, who should the king marry? That's the question at the heart of this passage. Who will the king marry? Is King Rehoboam or Lemuel? But actually, that question is at the heart of the Bible itself. Because the king in question ultimately is Jesus. And the whole story of the Bible is that King Jesus is looking for a bride. And that's not a woman, it's a people, the church, described as the bride of Christ. That's the story of the Bible. King Jesus is looking for a bride. So what kind of bride does he want? What kind of bride does he need? Well, amazingly, having just looked at Proverbs 31 and seen this woman in all her glory and loveliness, the incredible message of the gospel, the good news about Jesus is this. That instead of finding the most beautiful, the best, the most moral people, Jesus chose the least and the lowest. Sinners in rebellion against God, sinners made ugly by their sin. But through his willingness to give his life for his bride, he has made us beautiful in his sight, washing us clean from our sin and our filth. And he is transforming his bride, and he will transform his bride, so that in the end, this picture of perfection, this perfect wife we find in Proverbs 31, who serves and works and loves and is beautiful in the way that she reflects Jesus the King. This is the picture that Christ is making and plans to turn us into. And one day, we, the church, will be this beautiful bride, spending forever with the King. Let's pray. Our God and Father, we ask, Lord, that we would understand your word, that we would be challenged by it, Lord, that we would see what it means for each and every one of us. Oh, Lord, speak to us, we pray. Even as we come to an end, Lord, continue speaking to us through your word. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.